Elizabeth Perez had been working as a street sweeper for the last 7 years of her life. She didn't really love her job all that much. Unfortunately, Elizabeth simply couldn't get any other position. The woman swept the streets for days on end. She also raked the leaves and picked up the trash. Residents of the neighborhood had long become used to her screaming angrily at anyone who had the indecency to throw a cigarette butt on the ground. "Hey, you don't litter at home like that, do you? I bet you don't. There's no reason why you should do it outside," Elizabeth kept repeating day after day, leaning on her broom. Meanwhile, no one knew anything about Elizabeth's past and was at a loss about her age too. The fact was that spending most of her time outside didn't help the woman keep her youthful looks, and thus, judging by her appearance, one could assume that she was any age between 40 and 60. The truth was that Elizabeth was 50 years old, and she hadn't seen any good in her lifetime. Elizabeth's father had an alcohol abuse problem and was drunk for the better part of his life. Her mother worked as a cleaner at a roadside cafe that was mostly frequented by bikers and truckers. From an early age, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice how dull and hopeless her parents' life was. The best her mother could do was get her daughter some clothes at thrift stores, but most of the time, the girl had to make do with hand-me-downs from her cousins. Elizabeth simply had no other options at the time. She'd long grown accustomed to being bullied by her classmates and did her best to ignore them. After graduating from high school, Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief. "Finally, now I can start a new life and go to the university," the young woman thought. If only Elizabeth knew how wrong she was. The fact was that the young woman's parents were strongly against her attending university. "You should get a job first, see what it's like, and then you can go study whatever you want," her father said. Like an obedient daughter, Elizabeth trusted his opinion and made the worst mistake of her life. Having agreed to postpone going to college, she got stuck in a whirlpool of money problems and all kinds of responsibilities, which ultimately deprived her of the opportunity to get an education. Years flew by, but Elizabeth still couldn't find the opportunity to start college. And now, when she was already 50 years old, she didn't feel like she could even think about college anymore. Of course, not a day passed that the woman didn't regret the decision she had made in her past. Both of her parents had already died, and all that she was left was the bitter disappointment from the mistakes she had made in her youth. Nevertheless, Elizabeth didn't take her resentment out on her work and always did it with the utmost responsibility. She never felt embarrassed about her job and always considered it very important. Therefore, Elizabeth was very hard on anyone who dared to litter on the territory entrusted to her. One day, while sweeping the pavement near a bus stop, Elizabeth saw a boy of about 10 throw an apple core on the ground. Saying that Elizabeth was outraged would be a huge understatement. "Hey kid, what do you think you're doing? Can't you see the trash can?" The woman was indignant. To her surprise, the boy didn't seem the least bit fazed and immediately came up with an answer. "But that's not trash, it's biological waste. It'll stay there for a day or two and decompose, or even a tree will grow out of it." "Well, I don't know if anything will grow out of it, but I don't think that you go about your house throwing biological waste around," Elizabeth answered mercifully. "Well, that you're wrong about. There are much worse things around my house," the boy answered sadly. Only then did the woman realize that something was off with the boy. The truth was that all the kids his age were actually at school at that time of day. And that little boy clearly wasn't on his way there. And he didn't really look like he ever attended school at all. "Do you attend school, or do you hang around the street all day?" Elizabeth asked. The expression on the boy's face made her immediately realize that her question hit a sore spot for him. "Of course I do, but not too often. Once or twice a week. Enough to make sure that the social services don't come bothering my stepfather," the boy explained. Elizabeth decided not to ask the boy about his mother because she had a feeling that she wasn't in the picture. The woman had seen many dysfunctional families. She actually grew up in one of them. "What's your name, kid?" the woman asked, sounding much softer. "Bobby, ma'am, Bobby Green, but my friends call me Bob." The boy cheered up noticeably. "I'm Elizabeth Perez, Mrs. Perez, for you," Elizabeth replied. For some unknown reason, the woman immediately started feeling sympathy and pity for her little boy, who was clearly deprived of even the basic benefits of life. Looking at Bobby, Elizabeth probably saw herself many years ago, when she also believed her parents, who told her that school wasn't all that important. The next day, Elizabeth met Bobby again. Just like the day before, he was eating an apple, the remains of which he was clearly planning on throwing out into the flower bed. "Why don't you go to school more often? Do you want to spend your whole life on the streets?" Elizabeth asked. "Why should I bother? You probably did go to school, and here you are. So what's the point? You ended up cleaning after the likes of me," Bobby noted reasonably. The boy's comment hurt and disappointed Elizabeth. "The fact was that I didn't actually go to school, just like you. I thought that money was the most important thing," the woman said immediately. For a brief moment, she felt like Bobby looked at her with respect in his eyes. The way he behaved, the way he talked about life, involuntarily aroused sympathy in Elizabeth. There was no contempt in this boy, characteristic of children of wealthy parents, who treated street sweepers like they weren't people at all. Elizabeth knew that Bobby needed help, and that the sooner he got it, the better. The woman felt in her heart that the boy's stepfather didn't care about his future, and frankly, she didn't think he'd cared about the boy at all. The man probably didn't care whether the boy would hang on the street for the rest of his days or become a thief. Therefore, Elizabeth came up with the plan of action. "You know what? Let's make a deal. You seem like a reasonable person who values money, right? Here's the deal," the woman suggested. "What deal?" Bobby asked. "The deal is that I'll pay you $5 for every day you go to school," Elizabeth explained. Bobby's face showed genuine astonishment. "Really? You'll pay me $5 for each day? Is that some kind of a trick?" the boy exclaimed. "No, of course. Why would I trick you? Trust me, a woman in her 50s doesn't waste her time tricking 10-year-old boys," Elizabeth answered with a smile. "Well, it's a deal then," Bobby exclaimed with joy and extended his hand to the woman. From that day on, Bobby went to school every day. At first, the boy did it purely because of the money he regularly received from Elizabeth. But after about 6 months, Bobby realized that he no longer needed Elizabeth to pay him because he actually enjoyed studying. Nevertheless, Elizabeth still continued to pay the boy $5 every day, just as she promised. The woman felt that she was doing the right thing, maybe the only right thing in her entire life. First, Bobby was getting C's, then he was getting B's, and by the time he graduated, he became a straight A student. No one could understand how this miraculous transformation happened, and only Elizabeth knew the reason why Bobby started caring about school. Several years passed. After graduating from high school, Bobby went on to study at a prestigious university and fell out of touch with Elizabeth for a while. The woman wasn't mad at him for it. She understood that the young man had a life of his own and couldn't give up on it to spend time with some street sweeper. Moreover, the years she spent helping Bobby were the happiest in her life. One day, as she was clearing a parking lot off of the fallen leaves, Elizabeth noticed a car parked nearby. The woman didn't care about cars and knew nothing about them, but even she could tell that it was very expensive. "Some rich man must have parked here," Elizabeth said. She didn't feel jealous or anything, as she had long resigned herself to her fate. Soon, a fit young man in a business suit came out of the house across the street. Something in his gait seemed vaguely familiar to Elizabeth, but she couldn't figure out what it was. When the young man approached the car, the young woman's heart skipped a beat. "Bobby, is that you?" Elizabeth whispered. At that moment, the young man turned around and smiled sweetly at the woman. "Yes, it's me. I'm glad to see you, Mrs. Perez," Bobby exclaimed. A little later, when she was already sitting in a cozy cafe and drinking coffee, they shared the latest news from their lives. Actually, it was mostly Bobby who did all the talking, since nothing really changed in Elizabeth's life. She swept the streets just as before and lived in her parents' old house, which was pretty much falling apart. But Bobby actually had a lot to tell her. The young man successfully graduated from the university with a degree in economics and went on to build a career in business. Bobby was rather successful and had an impressive bank account, a big house, and an expensive car to prove it. It was actually Bobby's car that Elizabeth had noticed earlier. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. She had no way of knowing that by paying $5 to a boy to make him attend school, she'd help him grow into an intelligent young man capable of great success. Deep down, Elizabeth considered Bobby her son, although she was afraid to admit it, even to herself. Of course, Bobby understood what Elizabeth was feeling at that moment and tried not to touch up on sour topics. Upon learning that Mrs. Perez's house was a mess, the young businessman promised to solve her problem. At that moment, Elizabeth couldn't have even suspected that the young man would actually keep his promise. Elizabeth was so happy to have seen Bobby that she didn't care about the house at all and would have gladly lived out her days in it, because seeing Bobby's success was much more important to her. It took Bobby just 1 week to solve Elizabeth's problem. When everything was ready, he picked Elizabeth up at her home and took her to a completely different area, which was considered the best in the city. When Elizabeth got out of the car, she saw a nice cozy home with a lawn. There was even a terrace and a small pool in the yard. "Here, this is your house now," Bobby said with a smile and held out the keys. Tears were streaming down Elizabeth's cheeks. She didn't expect such gratitude and frankly was taken by surprise. Bobby stood nearby and looked at the woman, who started truly believing in miracles from that moment on. Bobby never forgot the times when he was roaming the streets and throwing trash on the ground. After all, if it weren't for Elizabeth, his life would have turned out very differently. But that wasn't all. In order to make it easier on Elizabeth's health, Bobby got her a job as an administrator at his firm. At first, Mrs. Perez felt rather uncomfortable at her new job and was afraid of every look and rustle. But over time, she got used to it and became everyone's favorite at the office. At the end of this amazing story, I'd like to say that the boomerang of good will sooner or later return to the one who launched it. Thus, when helping some little beggar on the street, you can be sure that when the time comes, someone will come to return the favor.